The sun had barely climbed above the horizon, and the sprawling expanse of the Highridge ranch lay bathed in a pale golden light. Dust swirled gently across the dry earth, rising in faint spirals from the hooves of a few wandering horses. At the far end of the property, a lone figure stood on the veranda of a weathered log cabin, gazing out over the endless fields, his expression as stoic as the mountains in the distance. This was Jeremiah Hawthorne, a man whose name carried weight in the nearby town, yet whose presence in society was rare. The townsfolk whispered about him, how a man could amass such wealth, yet live in such isolation. But few truly knew Jeremiah. Few knew the ache that settled deep in his chest each evening, a hollow loneliness that no amount of money or land could fill. Jeremiah had inherited the ranch from his father, a man whose own life had been defined by the unforgiving land. Jeremiah had grown up among these rolling plains, learning the harshness of the weather, the temperamental nature of cattle, and the endless toil required to keep a ranch alive. Yet, no matter how hard he worked, no matter how large his holdings became, the emptiness lingered. Nights were the hardest. The vast silence pressed against him, and he would often find himself staring at the stars, wishing for something or someone to make the long nights bearable. He had companions in the form of horses and dogs, loyal and steady, but they could not fill the void of human connection. Love had eluded him, and though the thought of a family had once seemed a distant dream, life's relentless demands and his own guarded nature had kept him apart from others. Jeremiah wasn't unkind, but he had built walls around himself, walls that had grown taller with each passing year, shielding him from both heartache and happiness. On this particular morning, Jeremiah's solitude felt heavier than usual. He had just returned from a trip to the neighboring town, where he had sold a portion of his cattle and purchased supplies for the ranch. The town had been bustling, filled with chatter, laughter, and the occasional clash of tempers in the saloon. Yet he had felt like an outsider, a silent observer in a world that seemed to move without him. He had stopped by the general store to pick up a few essentials and overheard a conversation that would change the course of his life. A woman's voice, weary and strained, carried through the doorway as she spoke to the storekeeper. Jeremiah's ears pricked at her words. She was talking of selling her daughter, a young woman who was pregnant, to anyone who could pay. The desperation in her tone struck him with a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. In his life of quiet routine, he had never encountered such raw, unfiltered despair. Yet buried beneath the shock, a strange sense of purpose began to stir. Perhaps, he thought, this was the chance he had been waiting for, a way to fill the emptiness that had defined his years. Jeremiah left the town with a restless mind. The idea of helping the woman and her child gnawed at him, challenging the rigid walls he had built around his heart. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ranch. Yet in the back of his mind, he could see her, the young woman, fragile and frightened, carrying the promise of life, and perhaps a chance for redemption for them both. As he returned to his cabin, Jeremiah felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The day the woman and her mother arrived at Highridge Ranch, the wind carried a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of the wide, open land. Jeremiah watched from a distance as a dusty wagon creaked to a stop near the cabin. A mother and daughter stepped down cautiously, their faces etched with exhaustion and worry. The mother's eyes darted nervously, scanning the ranch as if weighing every possibility. The daughter stayed close, her hands clasped tightly over her small, swollen belly, and her gaze fixed on the ground. Jeremiah approached slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the dirt. "You're here for the arrangement?" he asked, his voice steady, betraying none of the uncertainty stirring within him. The mother swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, sir. It's all we have left. I can't care for her and the child, not without help." Her voice trembled, a mix of shame and desperation. She avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the barren soil at her feet. Jeremiah studied the daughter, taking in the delicate curve of her face, the softness of her features, and the quiet vulnerability that radiated from her. She looked up for only a moment, her large, uncertain eyes meeting his. For a brief heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow to that single glance, and Jeremiah felt a pang of responsibility heavier than anything he had carried before. I don't want to be a burden," the young woman whispered, her voice barely audible. Her words were almost lost in the soft whisper of the wind through the dry grass. Jeremiah knelt slightly, lowering himself to her eye level. "You won't be a burden," he said firmly, though inside he wrestled with the strangeness of the arrangement. The woman was sold to him, legally, financially, but she was more than a transaction. She was a life, fragile and precious, and he knew his duty went far beyond the exchange of money. The mother fidgeted, producing a small satchel of coins and laying it on the porch. "This is all we can give," she said, her hands shaking. "Please, take care of her." She glanced at her daughter, her eyes glistening with tears. The unspoken apology lingered in the air, heavy and tangible. Jeremiah accepted the coins, though they seemed meaningless in the shadow of what truly mattered. "I'll see that she's safe," he said quietly. "I'll provide for her. And the child." The words felt strange on his tongue, almost foreign, but as he spoke them, a sense of resolve hardened inside him. This was more than charity. This was the beginning of something that might finally fill the emptiness he had carried for so long. The young woman took a hesitant step forward, her hand resting briefly on the edge of the wagon. Jeremiah noticed the trembling of her fingers and the way she seemed to shrink into herself, as though expecting rejection or punishment. But he only nodded, offering the faintest encouragement. "Come inside. You'll have your own room, food, and warmth. You won't be alone." It took time, but eventually she allowed him to lead her toward the cabin. The mother lingered for a moment, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face, then turned and climbed back into the wagon, leaving them behind. Jeremiah felt the weight of the departure, the lingering sorrow of a mother forced to part with her child. But he also felt the unspoken promise of hope, fragile and trembling like a newborn fawn in the morning light. Inside the cabin, the young woman sat quietly by the fire, hands folded over her belly. Jeremiah watched her for a long moment, feeling the awkward tension between them. There were no words that could undo the humiliation, the fear, or the uncertainty she had endured. All he could do was offer steadiness, consistency, and protection, and hope that trust could eventually bloom in the cracks left by her fear. Outside, the wind swept across the Highridge ranch, carrying the scent of dry earth and open skies. Inside, a new chapter had begun, one that neither of them could yet understand, but one that held the faint glimmer of the miracle that Jeremiah had longed for. The first weeks at Highridge Ranch were a test of endurance for both of them. The young woman, whose name was Clara, struggled to adjust to a life so far removed from the cramped, chaotic world she had left behind. The days were long, each hour filled with unfamiliar tasks, tending to the small garden, helping feed the animals, and learning the rhythm of the land that had shaped Jeremiah's life. Every task reminded her of how fragile and unprepared she felt, yet she persisted, driven by necessity and the faint hope that perhaps her life could be different. Jeremiah watched her carefully, noting the stiffness in her movements, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, and the hesitation with which she handled the animals. He resisted the urge to hover, knowing that overbearing concern could crush what little dignity she had left. Instead, he offered guidance in quiet, practical ways, showing her how to milk the cows without startling them, how to tend to a sick horse, and how to prepare simple meals. His instructions were curt at times, but never cruel, and gradually, Clara began to respond with a tentative trust. Despite the hardships, there were small victories. One morning, she managed to coax a stubborn calf into the pen without a single misstep, and the proud smile on Jeremiah's face startled her. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Not bad," he said simply, though his tone betrayed a hint of genuine admiration. Clara felt a small spark of pride flicker within her, a feeling she hadn't experienced in months. Still, the silence between them was heavy. Words were rare, and when they were spoken, they were cautious and clipped. Clara had been through too. Much to offer trust freely, and Jeremiah had lived too long in solitude to know how to breach the walls around his own heart. Yet even in the quiet, subtle connections began to form, an understanding forged in shared labor and the unspoken knowledge of their mutual dependence. One afternoon, a storm rolled across the plains, dark clouds swallowing the horizon and winds, whipping the dry grass into violent spirals. Clara struggled to secure the livestock in the barn, and Jeremiah was there by her side, guiding her hands, steadying her movements. The storm raged, but inside that small barn, a fragile sense of teamwork took root. Clara glanced up at him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw not the stern rancher who had purchased her, but a man who genuinely cared for the safety of another life. Her life. Evenings brought a different challenge. The nights were long and lonely, and Clara often sat by the hearth, staring into the fire and feeling the weight of her situation. Jeremiah would join her sometimes, bringing a cup of tea or a small piece of bread, sitting silently in respect for her quiet reflection. These gestures, simple as they were, began to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. Slowly, she realized that he was not the cold, transactional figure she had feared, but someone capable of patience, restraint, and care. There were moments of tension, too. Clara's fears, her shame, and her occasional resentment bubbled to the surface. But Jeremiah never responded with anger. Instead, he met her turmoil with steady calm, a quiet presence that reminded her she was not alone in this strange, harsh, new world. Over time, she began to glimpse the man behind the stoic exterior, a man who had known loneliness so deeply that he could not help but seek a spark of life in those around him. By the end of the first month, the routines of ranch life no longer seemed entirely alien to Clara. She could rise with the sun, handle the animals, and navigate the vast, open spaces of Highridge Ranch without fear of immediate failure. And though trust remained tentative, a thread of connection had begun to form between them, a fragile bridge over the chasm of uncertainty, one that promised, perhaps, the possibility of something more. As Clara looked out over the endless fields, one evening, the wind carrying the scent of earth and grass, she felt the first stirrings of hope. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that this strange arrangement might not only keep her alive, but perhaps even allow her to live. Life at Highridge Ranch was slowly settling into a rhythm, but the quiet of the eye. Open plains could not shield them from the murmurs of the nearby town. Word of Jeremiah's arrangement with Clara had spread like wildfire, carried by gossiping tongues eager to judge. By the time the wagon returned to town with fresh supplies, the townsfolk already had their stories ready, stories that twisted reality to suit their own sense of propriety. "They say he bought her," whispered one woman at the general store, clutching her shawl tightly. "The girl, and for a child, too. Can you imagine?" "They're desperate folk," muttered another man, shaking his head. "No good can come of it." Jeremiah, aware that rumors traveled faster than dust in a windstorm, remained stoic when the gossip reached him. Yet he could not deny the unease that prickled at the edges of his consciousness. He knew Clara felt it too. Her shoulders tensed when they passed other townspeople, her head lowered as though she could make herself invisible. Every whispered comment was a reminder of her vulnerability, and he could see the shame she tried so desperately to hide. One afternoon, a group of townspeople rode out to the ranch under the guise of delivering supplies. But their true intent was clear: to see the woman Jeremiah had bought and to judge for themselves whether this arrangement was proper. Clara stood near the barn, hands folded nervously over her stomach, her gaze fixed on the ground. Jeremiah positioned himself between her and the intruders, his presence a quiet shield. "We just wanted to see how she's faring," one woman said, but her tone was accusatory, heavy with suspicion. Jeremiah's jaw tightened. "She's well," he said simply. "She has everything she needs here. That's all you need to know." The visitors exchanged glances, some of them smirking, others frowning in disapproval. They lingered for a moment, but the firmness in Jeremiah's voice and the unspoken promise in his eyes persuaded them to leave. Even so, the damage of their judgment lingered. Clara's cheeks burned with embarrassment, and she struggled to meet his gaze. Over the next few days, the whispers continued. Children pointed at her in the streets, women shook their heads, and even some men cast wary glances when passing the ranch. Clara's confidence, already fragile, was tested at every turn. Yet Jeremiah remained steadfast, offering reassurance not with flowery words but through actions. He ensured she had a place in the house that was warm and private, tasks she could manage on her own, and moments of quiet encouragement when she faltered. One evening, as they sat on the cabin's porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Clara spoke for the first time about the weight she carried. I can't escape what people think of me," she admitted, her voice trembling. "No matter how safe I am here, their judgment, it follows me." Jeremiah placed a firm hand on hers, steady and grounding. "Let them think what they will," he said. "We're not living for them. You and your child are safe here, and that's what matters. I won't let anyone harm you." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to feel a glimmer of security. In the face of gossip, prejudice, and harsh judgment, she realized that Jeremiah's care was unwavering. His quiet strength became a beacon, a reminder that not all people would betray her trust or belittle her worth. Though the whispers did not cease, and though townspeople's eyes continued to follow her with suspicion, Clara began to understand that she had a protector, someone who saw her not as a transaction, but as a person worthy of dignity and care. And for the first time in months, perhaps years, she felt a fragile spark of hope flicker within her chest, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could survive, and even find a kind of belonging on this isolated, sun-drenched ranch. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the Highridge ranch with sudden ferocity. The sky darkened in minutes, and wind whipped the dry grass into a frenzy, rattling the barn doors and shaking the trees along the property's edge. Clara had been gathering firewood when the first flash of lightning split the sky, followed almost instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. Panic surged through her as the storm intensified, and she realized she was far from the cabin, alone in the chaos. Jeremiah, inside the house, heard her frantic cries over the roar of the wind. Heart pounding, he grabbed his coat and raced into the storm, each step threatening to betray him on the slick earth. Lightning illuminated her small, fragile form, and he saw her stumble, clutching her stomach, the fear in her eyes raw and palpable. His chest tightened. Without thinking, he reached her side, taking her arm and steadying her. "You're going to be all right," he said, his voice cutting through the storm's roar, firm yet soothing. "Hold on to me. We'll get back to the cabin." Clara's grip on him was desperate, her whole body trembling. The wind battered them, and for a moment it seemed as though nature itself was testing their resolve. Yet in that terrifying moment, something shifted between them. Jeremiah was no longer just a distant protector or a figure of authority. He was her anchor, the only presence she could rely on amid the chaos. When they finally reached the cabin, drenched and shivering, Jeremiah guided her inside and helped her remove the sodden outer layers. He built a small fire, its warmth a small reprieve from the storm's fury outside. Clara sank into a chair, exhausted, tears mingling with the rain that clung to her hair. "You scared me," she admitted softly, her voice breaking. I thought I might not make it back. Jeremiah knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on hers. I won't let anything happen to you, he said. Not now, not ever. His gaze met hers, unwavering and intense. For the first time, she felt the full weight of his commitment, not in words alone, but in the actions that had risked everything to ensure her safety. As the storm raged outside, the quiet between them was profound. It was no longer the awkward, tense silence of employer and charge or of transaction and necessity. There was a bond forming, fragile yet undeniable. Clara realized that the man who had seemed so distant and unapproachable could also be brave, selfless, and fiercely protective. Night fell, and the wind began to die down, leaving the ranch in an eerie calm. Clara wrapped herself in a blanket, leaning against the warmth of the fire, and for the first time in weeks, feeling a tentative sense of safety. She looked at Jeremiah, whose stern features were softened by exhaustion, and felt a flutter of gratitude and something deeper, something she could not yet name. You didn't have to come for me, she said, her voice small. I did. He replied simply, You and your child matter. That's reason enough. The words were unadorned, but they carried the weight of sincerity. For Clara, who had lived in fear and uncertainty for so long, they were transformative. She began to understand that trust was not built in grand gestures or promises. It was forged in moments of action, in the unwavering presence of someone who refused to let you fall, even when the world turned against you. By the time the storm had passed, Clara and Jeremiah had crossed an invisible threshold. Their relationship was no longer defined solely by circumstance or obligation. Something new had begun to take root, a sense of mutual reliance, respect, and the earliest sparks of emotional connection. And as she drifted off to sleep that night, warm and safe by the fire, Clara felt the faintest stirrings of hope. Hope that this isolated ranch, this man who had once seemed so distant, could become her sanctuary, her home, and perhaps something resembling a family. The days that followed the storm carried a new rhythm for both Clara and Jeremiah. The intensity of the incident had left its mark, both physically, with minor bruises and chills, and emotionally, with a fragile bond beginning to form. Clara no longer approached each day solely with fear or resignation. She was learning to navigate the ranch with purpose, and each task completed brought a quiet sense of pride. Jeremiah watched her closely, noting the subtle changes, the way her posture straightened slightly, the small smiles she allowed herself, and the way she began to speak with more confidence. It was in the ordinary moments, rather than dramatic gestures, that their connection deepened. Jeremiah taught Clara how to check the fences for weak spots and repair them, working side by side as the sun climbed high in the sky. He corrected her when she mishandled tools, but never harshly. His patience was a constant reassurance. Return, Clara began to anticipate his instructions, subtly easing his workload and showing that she was learning and adapting. The shared labor became a language of trust, each task a sentence in an unspoken conversation between them. One evening, after the animals had been fed and the last chores completed, they found themselves seated on the porch, watching the sun melt into the horizon. The sky was a riot of gold and crimson, the kind of breathtaking beauty that often went unnoticed in the rush of everyday life. Clara spoke softly, almost hesitantly. I never thought I'd find a place like this. I always assumed my life would be hard, painful, that it would end in misery. Jeremiah didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a small, worn blanket and draped it over her shoulders, his hand lingering just long enough to communicate concern without crossing boundaries. Life can be harsh, he said finally, but it can also surprise you. You're stronger than you realize, Clara, and I'm not going anywhere. Those words, simple, unadorned, yet weighted with sincerity, settled into her heart. She realized she was beginning to trust him, not merely as the man who had bought her, but as someone who genuinely cared for her well-being. It was a trust born not of obligation or circumstance, but of consistent care and quiet, unwavering presence. Days turned into weeks, and with them came small, tender moments. Jeremiah noticed her humming softly as she worked in the garden, and he felt a strange warmth at the sound. Clara noticed the way he would pause to check on her when she was alone with the animals, or the subtle way he made sure she had water and warmth during the hottest afternoons. These actions, almost imperceptible to an outsider, became the glue that bound them together. They began to share fragments of their lives, cautiously at first. Clara spoke of her childhood, of the dreams she once harbored, of the fears that had driven her mother's desperate decision. Jeremiah, in turn, revealed snippets of his past, his upbringing on the ranch, the losses that had shaped him, and the loneliness that had haunted him for years. Each revelation was a step across the invisible divide between them, a delicate bridge of vulnerability and understanding. One evening, as they sat together after supper, Clara rested her hand briefly over Jeremiah's as he handed her a cup of tea. It was a small gesture, yet it spoke volumes: trust, gratitude, and an unspoken acknowledgement of their shared experiences. Jeremiah met her gaze, a faint smile softening his normally stern features. "You're not alone anymore," he said, quietly. "And you won't be." For Clara, those words were more than reassurance. They were a promise. In the vast solitude of Highridge Ranch, surrounded by endless skies and open fields, two lives began to intertwine. Fear was slowly replaced by hope, hesitation by affection, and isolation by the beginnings of love. The storm had tested them, but it had also revealed what neither had expected, that amidst hardship, trust could be built, and hearts could find their way to one another. And so, as the night deepened and stars blinked into existence above the quiet ranch, Clara allowed herself to believe, for the first time in a long while, that she might not just survive, but live, with someone who cared in a place that could truly feel like home. The early mornings on Highridge Ranch were always quiet, with a soft mist hovering over the fields and the occasional call of a distant hawk breaking the silence. Clara had grown used to these hours, rising before the sun to tend to the animals and gather eggs from the hens. Jeremiah would often appear shortly after, sometimes to help, sometimes to simply walk beside her in companionable silence. The shared labor had become routine, yet it was during these ordinary moments that something extraordinary began to stir between them, a tender awareness that neither had anticipated. One morning, as Clara guided a stubborn horse into the corral, Jeremiah stepped closer, his presence calm and reassuring. "You've got the touch," he said quietly, a rare compliment in his usually restrained manner. Clara's cheeks warmed at the acknowledgement, and she felt an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. It wasn't just pride, it was the beginning of something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken and her thoughts linger on him longer than she wished. The bond between them grew subtly, threaded through small gestures and quiet attentiveness. Jeremiah began to notice the way Clara's eyes brightened when she accomplished a task successfully, or the way she lingered near the fire in the evenings, lost in thought. Clara, in turn, observed the gentle changes in Jeremiah, the softening of his gaze when he looked at her, the rare smiles that flickered across his face when he thought no one was watching. These moments, almost imperceptible, conveyed more than words could. They spoke of concern, admiration, and the tentative stirrings of affection. One afternoon, as the sun poured warmth across the ranch, Clara and Jeremiah worked side by side, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged by the recent storm. Their hands brushed occasionally, and each touch lingered a fraction longer than necessary, sending subtle jolts of awareness through both of them. Clara caught herself stealing glances at him when he wasn't looking, noticing the strength in his arms, and the quiet determination etched into his face. Jeremiah, too, found his thoughts wandering to her when she was out of sight, wondering about her comfort, her safety, and, increasingly, the softness of her voice. Evenings became a time of quiet intimacy. After chores, they would sit on the porch with mugs of tea, the world around them bathed in the gentle glow of sunset. Words came more easily now, laughter sometimes spilling into the still air. Clara would recount fleeting memories of her childhood, of simpler times before hardship had hardened her world. Jeremiah shared stories of life on the ranch, of lessons learned and mistakes made. The stories were mundane, yet they served as a bridge, drawing them closer and dissolving the lingering distance that had existed between them. One night, a chill swept across the plains, and Clara shivered as she wrapped herself in a blanket. Jeremiah noticed immediately and rose to fetch a second one, draping it around her shoulders. "There," he said, his voice gentle. "That should keep you warm." The simple gesture, accompanied by the sincerity in his eyes, struck Clara deeply. She realized that the line between protector and companion was blurring, and that the feelings stirring in her heart were no longer confined to gratitude. They were becoming something more, something tender and complicated. For Jeremiah, the realization was equally profound. He had spent years in solitude, guarding his heart against pain and disappointment. Yet now, with Clara near, he found himself longing for her presence beyond practicality or duty. Her laughter, her small victories, and even her quiet fears became entwined with his own sense of purpose and hope. He realized with a mixture of awe and trepidation that his feelings for her had evolved into something he had never dared to imagine. Affection, tender and insistent, that demanded recognition. As the night settled over the ranch, Clara rested, her head against the back of her chair, wrapped in the warmth of both blanket and company. The stars above twinkled faintly in the clear sky, witnesses to the subtle shift in their relationship. Between them, a new unspoken understanding had begun to take root, a fragile, delicate spark of affection that promised the possibility of love, should they dare to nurture it. The days that followed were quiet and filled with anticipation. Clara's belly had grown heavy with the life she carried, a constant reminder of both vulnerability and hope. Jeremiah had never experienced anything like it. He had cared for livestock, tended the land, and navigated the harsh realities of life on the ranch, but the thought of protecting another human being and the child within her brought forth a depth of feeling he had never known. The night it began. The sky was ink black, the wind whispering through the trees, as though nature itself sensed the magnitude of what was about to occur. Clara awoke in the early hours, her body racked with the first waves of labor. Panic briefly flared within her. She was alone, far from the comforts of town, and the unfamiliar pain threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered Jeremiah. Jeremiah, awakened by her cries, was instantly at her side. "I'm here," he said, voice steady, reassuring. "We'll get through this together." The intensity of her labor was matched only by the intensity of his focus. He moved with practiced calm, fetching water, adjusting blankets, and speaking softly to her, his presence a constant anchor amid the storm of pain. The hours stretched long, each moment testing their endurance and fortitude. Clara's cries filled the cabin, mingling with the sound of the wind outside. Yet there was no fear in Jeremiah's eyes, only unwavering determination and compassion. He guided her through each contraction, whispering encouragements, holding her hand, and keeping her grounded when the pain threatened to consume her entirely. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the cries of a newborn pierced the night, sound more miraculous than any Jeremiah had ever imagined. The child's first breath, fragile yet filled with life, brought tears to Clara's eyes. Jeremiah, too, felt the weight of awe and joy press upon him. He had longed for a family, for the miracle of life to transform the emptiness of his existence. And here it was, in the form of a tiny, vulnerable infant resting in his arms. Clara collapsed back onto the bed, exhausted, her body trembling with relief and emotion. She looked at Jeremiah, her eyes glistening. We did it," she whispered, her voice breaking with joy and disbelief. Jeremiah, overwhelmed by a mix of pride, love, and gratitude, gently laid the child in her arms. The bond was immediate and electric, mother and child, connected in ways words could not capture. Clara cradled the baby close, feeling the warmth and fragility of new life against her chest. She looked at Jeremiah once more, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. They had survived the ordeal together, and in doing so, their lives had irrevocably changed. Over the following days, the miracle of the child brought a new rhythm to the ranch. The tiny cries, the careful feedings, and the quiet moments of awe and wonder transformed the household. Jeremiah was a constant presence, learning to care for the newborn with the same patience and attentiveness he had shown Clara. He marveled at the life they had nurtured together, a tangible symbol of hope, love, and resilience. Clara, too, found herself changed. Her fear and uncertainty began to fade, replaced by the fierce protective instinct of a mother and the growing trust she placed in Jeremiah. She realized that he was not only her protector but also her partner in this new chapter of life, a man who had faced loneliness and hardship and had chosen to embrace love and responsibility when given the chance. As the sun rose over Highridge ranch, casting golden light over the fields and the cabin, the three of them, mother, father, and child, sat together, a family forged in adversity, strengthened by trust, and united by the miracle of life. In that moment, Jeremiah felt a completeness he had never known, a fulfillment of a longing that had haunted him for years. Clara, holding her child close, felt safety, hope, and the first real sense of home. And the child, unaware of the hardships that had brought them into the world, represented the promise of a future filled with love, devotion, and the quiet miracles that life, when embraced, could deliver. The birth of Clara's child brought joy and relief to Highridge Ranch, but the world beyond its fences was not as easily tamed. News of the baby spread quickly through the nearby town, and while some neighbors offered congratulations, others were less kind. Gossip continued to swirl, fueled by suspicion and judgment. Many whispered about the unconventional arrangement that had brought Clara and Jeremiah together, questioning the legitimacy of their bond and the morality of the situation. For Clara, the renewed scrutiny was difficult. She had hoped that the child's arrival would silence critics and offer her some measure of respect, but judgment is a stubborn thing, especially in small towns where tradition and rumor often outweigh reason. She found herself hesitating when, venturing into town, bracing for the sideways glances, whispered comments, and occasional cruel remark. Jeremiah, however, remained a steadfast protector. He refused to let the opinions of others dictate their lives. Each morning he would ride into town alongside Clara and the child, ensuring they were safe and asserting quietly but firmly that they were not to be harassed. "We've earned the right to live our lives," he said one evening, his tone resolute. "No one else can dictate how we raise our family. Not now, not ever." Despite his reassurance, challenges arose. A few townspeople attempted to interfere, one claiming the child should be taken, another trying to discredit Clara's character. Jeremiah confronted them calmly, yet with unwavering authority, making it clear that any interference would not be tolerated. His actions were deliberate and measured. He didn't need to shout or threaten, for the certainty in his eyes communicated everything. Slowly, even the most skeptical townsfolk began to recognize that he would not be swayed, and that Clara and her child were firmly under his protection. At the ranch, life resumed its rhythm. The presence of the baby altered their days in the most profound ways. Clara grew more confident, learning the subtleties of caring for a newborn while managing household duties and ranch work. Jeremiah's interactions with the child revealed a softer side of him that few had ever witnessed. He marveled at the small miracles of the child's expressions, the gentle grasp of tiny fingers, and the innocent trust placed in their care. Through these shared experiences, the bond between Clara and Jeremiah deepened. Their relationship was no longer defined by circumstance or necessity. It had evolved into a partnership, strengthened by mutual respect, trust, and the shared responsibility of raising a child. They laughed together, planned together, and faced the uncertainties of ranch life as a united front. Gradually, the townspeople began to accept them. The whispers persisted, but they carried less weight. When neighbors observed the care, dedication, and genuine love that Jeremiah and Clara displayed, even skeptics softened. Over time, the narrative shifted from one of judgment to one of quiet admiration. The couple's resilience, kindness, and commitment to their child spoke louder than any rumor. By the time the first snow dusted the ranch in late autumn, Highridge ranch had become a place of stability and security. Clara no longer feared judgment. The townsfolk had, if grudgingly, come to recognize the family for what it was, a testament to love, dedication, and the power of perseverance. Jeremiah, who had once been a solitary figure wandering the plains, had found not only companionship and love, but a family built through trust, courage, and shared trials. Sitting together one evening, Clara nursing the baby while Jeremiah held her hand, they both understood that the battles outside the ranch were far less significant than the life they were building within it. They had faced prejudice, danger, and uncertainty, and emerged stronger, closer, and more united than ever. What had begun as an unlikely arrangement had transformed into something lasting, real, and deeply cherished. Highridge Ranch was no longer merely a place of solitude. It was a home, a sanctuary, and a symbol of triumph over the hardships that life had thrown their way. And as the sun set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the fields, the family sat together, secure in the knowledge that they had weathered every storm, both literal and metaphorical, and had emerged whole. Winter had settled softly over Highridge Ranch, blanketing the fields in pristine white and turning the world into a quiet, serene landscape. The ranch, once a place of solitude and silence, now hummed with life, the coos of the baby, the shuffle of horses in the stables, and the soft laughter of Clara as she moved through the house. Jeremiah watched her from the doorway, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. The transformation of his life, once defined by loneliness and longing, now felt complete in a way he had never imagined possible. Clara had grown stronger, her confidence deepened by the love and security she felt on the ranch. She moved through her days with purpose, guiding the household, caring for her child, and tending to the land. The bond between her and Jeremiah had blossomed into something steady and profound. Their affection was no longer tentative. It had matured into love, grounded in trust, respect, and the countless trials they had endured together. On a clear winter morning, Jeremiah led Clara and the baby outside to the barn, where the animals were settling into their stalls. Snow crunched beneath their boots, and the cold air painted their cheeks pink. As Clara adjusted the baby in her arms, she looked up at Jeremiah, gratitude and affection shining in her eyes. "I never imagined my life could be like this," she whispered. Jeremiah's hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I thought I'd be alone forever, wandering these fields with only the wind for company. But now," his gaze softened as he looked at her, then at the baby. "Now I have a family, you and this little one. You're my home." The words hung between them, carrying the weight of every hardship, every fear, and every moment of trust that had led to this point. Clara felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of completeness she had never known. The child stirred. In her arms, cooing softly, as if acknowledging the truth in Jeremiah's words. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of their life settled into something beautiful and enduring. The townspeople, who had once whispered and judged, began to see the family as they truly were, resilient, loving, and united. Invitations to town gatherings arrived, neighbors stopped by to share warm greetings, and slowly, acceptance replaced suspicion. Highridge Ranch was no longer an isolated haven. It had become a symbol of hope, perseverance, and the transformative power of love. Jeremiah found joy in the smallest moments, watching Clara laugh as the baby kicked gently against her chest, feeling the first tentative steps of the child in the soft snow, and listening to Clara recount stories of their past, their struggles, and their triumphs. The ranch, once a place of emptiness and solitude, now vibrated with life, love, and the quiet contentment of a family that had fought for its place in the world. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the snow-covered hills, Clara and Jeremiah sat together on the porch, the baby nestled between them. The sky was a riot of pink and gold, casting long shadows across the frozen fields. Jeremiah's arm wrapped around Clara, drawing her close, and she rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady warmth of his presence. All of this, Clara murmured. It feels like a miracle. Jeremiah smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. It is, he said simply, a miracle we built together. And in that moment, with the snow glinting like diamonds across the fields, the fire crackling softly inside, and the quiet breathing of their child, between them, Jeremiah and Clara knew that the journey that had begun in desperation and fear had transformed into one of love, fulfillment, and hope. The loneliness of the past was gone, replaced by family, trust, and the unshakable certainty that whatever challenges life might bring, they would face them together. Highridge Ranch was no longer just land and buildings. It was home. And in that home, Jeremiah, Clara, and their child had found the miracle they had each been waiting for, the miracle of life, love, and a new beginning.